much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. It's wonderful to see so many people of all ages here, and especially many young people getting involved in nuclear weapons work. So I was asked to speak a bit about the nuclear taboo and how it connects to the ban treaty. This has obviously been a very difficult time for the nuclear taboo this past year with all of Russia's nuclear threats, as our earlier speakers have mentioned. I have to say that this past year has been the first time in my entire professional life of thinking and writing about nuclear weapons, the first time that I have really worried that a country would use nuclear weapons. And so it has been a very scary moment, and I think it continues to be, as long as this war goes on, it continues to be a very dangerous moment. But it does highlight the many downsides of a reliance on nuclear deterrence. So what I'm going to do here is just to talk a little bit about what the taboo is and how it developed, and then how it connects to the nuclear ban treaty. So the nuclear taboo is a norm, an international norm of non-use of nuclear weapons. And it is connected, it's a widespread inhibition on the first use of nuclear weapons. It's connected with a sense of moral opprobrium and a widespread sense of revulsion at the catastrophic destructive power of these weapons. It's associated with now a 77-year tradition of non-use of nuclear weapons. This 77-year tradition is the single most important fact of the nuclear age. After nuclear weapons, after the U.S. used atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many people thought that it was only a matter of time that nuclear weapons would be used again. Like historically, once a weapon is developed and invented and disseminated, it tends to get used. And so people thought they were used, they're going to be used again. And instead, we have this 77-year tradition, history of non-use. And it's an interesting question, why did this happen? Deterrence is part of it. I argue that a moral factor, a normative factor, the nuclear taboo, has helped to restrain states when they've thought about using nuclear weapons. Now, this taboo emerged during the Cold War, but it was what we call a de facto norm. It was not, there's no specific legal prohibition. It wasn't legalized. There's humanitarian law that does engage the question of nuclear use, but there wasn't any specific legal prohibition, and the nuclear-armed states regularly argued that there was no reason they couldn't use nuclear weapons, that there was no law preventing it. They had a right to rely on the threat of use of nuclear weapons. As you know, since 2017, the nuclear taboo has now been codified in the ban treaty, and so it is now a legalized a norm with legal force. Why is this taboo important? So it is a very important norm of nuclear restraint. We have other norms of nuclear restraint. We could think about the global nuclear normative order. Non-proliferation is a norm of nuclear restraint. The norm against testing nuclear weapons is a norm of nuclear restraint. But the norm of use, in my view, is the central norm of nuclear restraint. I think it does reinforce deterrence, especially deterrence between two mutually armed nuclear states. It does help to reinforce that deterrence. And it may restrain the use of nuclear weapons, and I think it does, even when a nuclear deterrence relationship doesn't operate. So a relationship, a nuclear state versus a non-nuclear state. I think the norm stigmatizes the use of nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state. Where did the taboo come from? So the most important factor, there are a number of factors, but the most important one was a global grassroots anti-nuclear movement that stigmatized, helped to stigmatize the bomb. And there was the civil society, but also disarmament politics at the United Nations and the assistance of many non-nuclear states. There are three key periods of the global anti-nuclear movement. In the 1950s, this is when the first big anti-nuclear movement arose in Britain, in the United States, in Japan, and elsewhere. These protests were spurred by atmospheric nuclear testing and the fear people had that strontium-90, a radioactive isotope, was getting into calcium and into milk and into people's bones. And these protests in the 1950s led to one of the very first arms control treaties, which was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which pushed nuclear testing underground. The second big period of anti-nuclear activism was in the 1980s. Some of you folks in the audience on the older side may remember these. In the United States, in Europe, these were the biggest anti-nuclear protests ever. They were spurred in part by the very aggressive, what was perceived to be a very aggressive warfighting stance of the Reagan administration, President Ronald Reagan in the United States, who was really going to fight the Cold War really hard, developed a very aggressive nuclear doctrine built around actual use of nuclear weapons, what's called warfighting. So the protests arose against that. The nuclear freeze movement arose at this time. And this was a period, a big period, where moral debate about nuclear weapons was reintroduced into the deterrence discourse. And then we have today, the period today, where we are now. I think this began perhaps with President Obama's speech in Prague in April 2009, where he recommitted the United States to disarmament and said that because the United States had been the only country to ever use nuclear weapons, the US had a moral obligation to lead on disarmament. Very important speech. I think it spurred the current moment, especially with the disappointment that followed the follow-through. President Obama's follow-through in disarmament was not so great. So what do these movements do? They do what ICAN is doing today. They raise the issue of moral opprobrium. They insert moral discourse into the strategic debate, and they try to mobilize public opinion to stigmatize the bomb. The single most important contribution of the global grassroots anti-nuclear movement was to make it impossible to think of nuclear weapons as just another weapon. That these are different, they're not like any old weapon in the arsenal. Later on, when the US and Soviet Union had achieved a situation of mutual assured destruction, MAD, when they could both wipe each other out, then you have, at this point, a kind of rationalist source of the norm came in. It's rational to have a norm of non-use if you can completely destroy each other. So that's the strategic element. So both strategic interests and moral concerns have contributed to the emergence of the nuclear taboo. Now, just to get a sense of what it was like in the early days, so this is a quote from US President Eisenhower. It's a meeting with his National Security Council in 1953 toward the end of the Korean War. And here they're discussing whether they could use nuclear weapons to finally end the Korean War if China didn't agree to armistice terms. And so what you see, they are aware that a nuclear taboo is emerging, and they associate it with negative public opinion regarding nuclear weapons. And so they're talking and they're saying, we have to get rid of this taboo because it's in the way. It's preventing us from feeling free to use the weapons in our arsenal. So they say, somehow or other, the taboo which surrounds the use of atomic weapons would have to be destroyed. They want to get rid of it. And then they say, we have got to consider the atomic bomb as just another weapon in our arsenal. This was the 1950s. And so this is how they were thinking, that they're already aware that there's these normative constraints emerging, but they don't like them. They would like to do away with them because it inhibits their freedom to use nuclear weapons. Let's fast forward now to the Vietnam War. So this is a document by the CIA, the US Central Intelligence Agency, the intelligence analysts, and they're offering an analysis of what the reaction would be if the United States used nuclear weapons. It would probably be tactical nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War. There was no serious consideration of doing so by the higher levels, but there was some lower level analysis. And so here the CIA, all right, not notably an organization that's especially respectful of norms, is offering an analysis of norms, saying if the US used nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War, there would be a, quote, a widespread and fundamental revulsion that the US had broken the 20-year taboo on the use of nuclear weapons. So here is evidence for how the taboo enters into the decision-making of leaders who were thinking maybe about possibly using nuclear weapons in a conflict. Now, again, in Vietnam, I don't think it was serious. In the Korean War, higher level, more serious. But this shows that the taboo has influenced decision-making. So today, the nuclear taboo is under pressure, as we all know. This has been a year of unbelievable nuclear threats by Russia. I should note that the Ukraine war is not the first time a nuclear-armed state has invaded a non-nuclear state. So the United States invaded Vietnam and Iraq. Russia invaded Afghanistan. Soviet Union then invaded Afghanistan. But this is represents the most explicit use of nuclear threats to shield a conventional invasion and to keep NATO and the United States out. So Russia is not using nuclear threats here to defend the national security of Russia. It's using nuclear threats to have its way in Ukraine. That part is different, and these nuclear threats have come on a very regular basis. Every few days, especially at the beginning of the war, there is another nuclear threat. So this has been very damaging for the nuclear taboo because it normalizes nuclear weapons and it suggests that it's legitimate to use them. There has been important pushback, and I think the pushback has been pretty good, in my view. So the world's response to Putin's threats has helped to uphold the taboo, to reinforce it, to make it clear that the world thinks that the taboo is important. So it's especially important. Russia's friends, like China and India, have told Putin that it would be unacceptable to use nuclear weapons. Of course, the UN Secretary General has, Biden, other Western leaders. And so they've basically made it clear to Putin that if he used nuclear weapons, Russia would lose any status, any prestige as a superpower, a great power, especially in the eyes of the global South, of states who are either neutral or loosely aligned with Russia. It's clear that they would not regard use of tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war as any kind of great thing. It would undermine, it would eliminate Russia's status as any kind of superpower or great power. So I think this has been important. I think the language, the phrase nuclear taboo has been used a lot, not only by leaders, but lots of journal articles and newspaper articles and so on. So there has been a strong discourse of the nuclear taboo, and this needs to continue. Unfortunately, Russia is not the only country that has engaged in irresponsible talk about the use of nuclear weapons. We can go back to our friends Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. Back in the day, they engaged in 2018, 2019, they engaged in a lot of nuclear bullying and brandishing the nuclear arsenal. North Korea continues to make fairly regular nuclear threats, mostly against the United States. And Trump apparently discussed with his advisors, he kept asking his advisors, why can't I use nuclear weapons? We have them, why can't I use them? This is yet another tell-all book that has come out and said, well, Trump kept asking about whether he could use nuclear weapons on North Korea. This is, of course, after he had, probably before and after he had said he had exchanged love letters with Kim Jong-un. Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, has also talked very loosely about India's nuclear arsenal, even though India claims that it is a responsible nuclear state. But here he is brandishing the nuclear arsenal against Pakistan, saying that it's there to be used. And Pakistan regularly returns the language. Pakistan's acquiring nuclear weapons in 1998. Pakistan has engaged in quite a lot of threat-making, repeatedly threatens India with nuclear weapons. Again, many of these cases are not serious, but India and Pakistan have been engaged in several direct crises where then the threats become quite risky. But again, this kind of talk, this kind of loose talk about nuclear weapons legitimizes the weapons, normalizes them, suggests they are usable nuclear weapons in the arsenal, and we should be able to use them. Okay, zooming up to the ban treaty. So, in 2017, the ban treaty was negotiated, as you know, and it entered into force in January 2021. And the ban treaty makes the taboo a legal prohibition. So it is not just a de facto international norm, it's now a legal prohibition. And this is Article 1 of the treaty. And you can see here where it says that each state commits not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons or other explosive devices. So that's the codifying the nuclear taboo. And ICAN and the ban campaign has been very explicit that this was one of the goals of the treaty, to codify the prohibition on use. So how do we strengthen the taboo in the future? Where do we go going forward? And so the ban treaty is going to play a very important role because the taboo now has an institutional home. And we know from social science research that when norms are built into institutions, when they are embedded in institutions, they are more robust, they are more enduring, they are more lasting because they have an institutional home, they have an institutional platform, they're formal, they're legalized. So it does now have an institutional legalized home, and that is important for sustaining it and strengthening it going forward. The continued stigmatization of nuclear weapons is essential. The taboo is part of that. The ban treaty is part of that. Together, pushing the ban treaty forward among states and knowledge about the ban treaty among the public is essential. But this is a key strategy for continuing to delegitimize nuclear weapons. World leaders should continue to publicly reaffirm their commitment to the taboo. I call this taboo talk. When people get up and talk about the taboo, the importance of the 77-year tradition of nuclear non-use, the importance that that tradition continue forever. This used to be a talking point of the Obama administration. We hope this tradition of non-use continues forever. That kind of thing, that's taboo talk. We should have lots of taboo talk from world leaders. Things like the Reagan-Gorbachev statement, nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, those kinds of things. People should put pressures on leaders to say those things. The discourse is really important. Of course, actions are important too, but the discourse, the way people talk about nuclear weapons, the way leaders talk about nuclear weapons is really important. And so journalists should ask leaders questions about this. What can we do to strengthen the taboo? What are you doing to strengthen the taboo? Journalists should put leaders and government officials on the spot. Finally, of course, many things that states could do to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security policies as part of pursuing the elimination of nuclear weapons ultimately and a nuclear-free world. So those are my comments on the nuclear taboo and the connection to the ban treaty. I'm really thrilled that you guys are all here to work on these issues. I'm going to stop now, and I'd be happy to take any questions about what's going on today, Russia-Ukraine, the nuclear dimensions of the Russia-Ukraine war, anything else that's relevant and you're interested in. Thank you very much.